Hello YouTube, and welcome to ASMR Visual Novels. This episode is from Wanderlust Travel Stories, a choose-your-own travel adventure series of memoirs, developed by the Poland-based studio Different Tales. In this video, we will be exploring the life of Henrietta, who yearns for the sea. The travel narrative is the oldest in the world, the story the wanderer tells to the folk gathered around the fire after his or her return from a journey. This is what I saw, and it is the origin of narrative fiction too, the traveler enlivening a dozing group with invented details, embroidering on experience. A small green dot in the middle of the Pacific. 6 hours flight to anywhere. A bar. A chance meeting. Imagine that you arrive on the island. Imagine that you were greeted with the flower necklace. Imagine how impatient you are to see the famous moai. Imagine that you live on the island. Imagine preparing for the next batch of tourists. Imagine how busy you are. With people engaged in their routines, it was no wonder that only the ancient stoneheads paid any attention to the weather. The rain came out of nowhere, a curtain of water obscuring the view from the terrace. I watched the tourists. Surprised tourists, swearing and laughing, scattered around looking for a place to hide. They forgot about the giant stoneheads that made the island famous and focused on protecting their cameras, phones, and wallets from getting drenched. After the stifling heat of that day, the sudden shower was a blessing. Yet they ran. Soon the bar was full. Soon the last group of tourists found shelter under an awning on the terrace. The bar was a popular place. The view was beautiful, and the beer was cold, local, and expensive. As always, the tourists all looked the same. If you listened to their accents, you could try and guess where they came from, especially when they were as loud and made as much disturbance as the wet group under the awning. I watched. In situations like that, you do not wish to pry, but you notice. The rain brought them together, and soon they sat down and made themselves comfortable. I must confess that I was observing them on purpose. Who was I? It's not important who I was. That would become clear at the right moment. What interested me was their story. They were all Europeans, still excited that they were on an island over 2,000 miles away from the nearest continent. At first, I thought it was a group of friends. But no, their awkward body language revealed that they'd met for the first time. "So, who are you all?" asked someone. I was also curious. That was the question, wasn't it? I don't know how about you, but I love watching people, imagining who they are, trying to get under their skin, trying to understand. Trying to understand what makes them tick. What scares that guy? What's that lady longing for? What do they regret? Most of the time, I am left with my musings, but sometimes, just sometimes, I get a peek behind the curtain, straight into someone's soul. I always pick one person, making them the protagonist of my imagined stories. When I try to focus on too many people at once, there's no real connection. It all remains superficial, like I could only see the inside of my head. It was easy this time. One of them got my attention instantly. Was it the eyes? Her eyes were shrewd. Sometime earlier, she walked in, looked around, ordered a beer, and paid. She sat at the table on the terrace and locked her eyes on the sea. Shortly before the rain, she moved under the awning. I knew the type. Always on the move. She was one of those people who couldn't stay in one place for long, and I bet she cared less for the places she visited than for the journey itself. Then the others came. Later that evening, for a bunch of strangers, they got along well. The rain stopped, giving way to a beautiful sunset, and they didn't even notice. Drops of water shining on the palm leaves, small lizards catching the last rays of sun, the dormant volcano in the distance, all that was lost on them. They talked over their beers, joking, laughing, getting to know one another. I watched them. We've just arrived and, frankly, I needed to meet some new people. The woman raised her glass. I'm Henriette, and he's Henry. The older man smiled a crooked smile and nodded. You could see the resemblance, the same eyes, the same no bullshit attitude. I was curious what made them tick, and what would happen between them. Would they remain strangers? Would they become friends? Would drama ensue? Introductions followed. The older lady from Portugal was called Adelia. Henriette and her father came from the UK. The younger woman, Martine, was from Germany, and the guy from Poland was called Tomek. I watched Henriette. I watched them, more and more curious if I'd chosen the right person. I've been planning this for some time now, said Henriette. Normally I try and avoid family trips, but it seems I couldn't wriggle out of this one. I could sense a story there. She tried to make it sound boring, but I sensed a story there. There was definitely more to her than met the eye. Time would tell what kind of person she really was. They talked about how small Rapa Nui seemed from the plane and how big it was when you walked, compared notes on the accommodation, all stayed in Hongrois, as it was the only town on the island, and planned their sightseeing. But who are you all? Henriette asked. A few beers later, what are your stories? Oh, I love a good story, but I'm not sure if we've got enough time for everyone to tell one of the others answered. One night won't be enough. Well, are any of you leaving tomorrow? I know I'm not, Henriette said. Let's spend the next few days together, see the island. I'm sure they can find a guide here, and tell each other our stories. They agreed. Henriette shook her head. We need a theme, she said. The others looked at her, curious. I also watched her as he asked, what was the journey that changed you the most? I wondered why they assumed that you needed a journey to change. They watched the sunrise. The lonely statue. There was a distinct chill in the twilight air. They sat there, suspended night and day. The sun of the sea and the sound of the waves were even more noticeable. And then there was light. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the row of giant silhouettes appeared against the brightening sky. They watched in awe. They sat on their blankets, yawning and whispering, trying not to disturb the atmosphere of the Rapa Nui sunrise. They noticed the statue. Did you see the statue near the entrance? Asked Martine when they went for a walk sometime later. I wonder why they put it there. There was one statue with its back to the others, isolated from the main ahu. A guardian, perhaps, suggested Adela. Or maybe it just needed some solitude, smiled Henriette. We all need some from time to time. And I guess my story is about that. She took a sip from her thermos, giving them time to focus. Sometimes the sea beckons, and I have to answer, she said, looking at the waves. Sea fever, Antarctica. Our apartment in London. Are you ready, darling? I took a long, quizzical look at my sea bag, and then at my husband. He was leaning against the door, graceful as a cat. Our cat, by comparison, was a shapeless blob of fluff. She stared coldly at me from the hallway, clearly disgruntled by my packing. Almost. I reached out and took a manila folder from the nightstand. I still don't understand why you do it, he said, and I sensed some tension under his careless smile. Was he worried? The case or the sea? I asked, shoving the folder into the bag. Both, I guess. You know me, I just have to, I shrugged. You must go down to seas again, to the lonely sea and the sky, he said, hugging me. You and your sea fever. Says the man who's been around the world twice. But I've never sailed to the Antarctic on a tall ship. It is quite tall, isn't it? I sighed, exasperated. I sighed into his chest. He chuckled. I looked up. You're worried. I confirmed my suspicion. His back was unusually tense. What's wrong? Darling, you're sailing into the Antarctic. I'm scared you're going to fall into the sea and freeze, or be eaten by a bear. I shook my head and sighed. You're lucky I married you for your looks, and you're being overprotective. I'll be fine. I'll be back at the beginning of December, just in time for Christmas preparations. You'd better be. If you're not, you'll miss your birthday present. Catch a plane. Looking out of the window. It was raining, of course, when I boarded the train to Oxfordshire. I'd planned to take a standard flight to Sao Paulo, and then fly to Santiago, and from there to Punta Arenas. But then I realized that I needed to clear my head and have some sort of privacy before being locked up with 8 other people for 5 weeks. A military plane was just the ticket. I'd fly straight to the Falkland Islands, with only one stop to refuel in Cape Verde. I'd never been to the Falkland Islands before, but of course Dad had been there before I was born. There were some photographs of the islands that used to grace the walls of his study. I always thought it was Scotland. The same bare rocks, the same grey skies. No wonder the British were so fond of them. RAF Bryce Norton, Oxfordshire. The plane was huge, unattractive, and surprisingly comfortable. It looked like I was the only civilian on board. Henry, boomed a voice behind me in a broad Scottish accent. Young Henry Taylor. I felt myself grin from ear to ear. I turned around and was immediately embraced by a boulder of a man. It's good to see you, Alasdair. Are you the co-pilot? Aye, that I am, lass. How are you then? Off on your big Antarctica trip, are ye? He looked over my shoulder. And your da? He's on a cruise. Oh, he's going the tourist route this time. On a cruise. He passed on 5 weeks of acute discomfort and the chance to freeze his bullocks off? Ha! He is getting old. Has he started working again? You know, since... No, I answered. My good mood suddenly disappeared. The tarmac looked more drab and gray than before, and a gust of cold wind rushed past, chilling me to the bone. "Are ye all right, lass?" "Not really, no. Like Dad used to say, somebody just walked over my grave." He put his hand on my shoulder and sighed. "The Germans called it Riesifiber. Dinna fret yourself over it, lass." I nodded, but something told me it wasn't so simple. On a plane, working, the manila folder felt heavy in my hands as I leafed through the papers again. The case was a representative action against a major multinational. I can't mention any names, but you've all heard of them, I'm sure. It was a noble cause, but likely to be tied up in court for the foreseeable future. I'd have to spend hours upon hours searching for precedent, going over everything with a fine-tooth comb so we could make a nuanced case. If I went for it, I'd be buried for months, maybe years. I'd be stuck in London, working long, tedious hours, likely appealing and reappealing. I suppose that's the price you had to pay for justice. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and sighed. Alastair took my arm. Cabo Verde. Somehow, I'd managed to sleep through the landing in Cape Verde. I woke up when Alastair shook my arm. "Coffee?" "Yes, that would be lovely," I said, trying to shake off the unpleasant dreams I'd had. I took the cup and looked at the manila folder in my lap. The documents had fallen onto the floor while I was asleep. Careful not to spill the coffee, I put the documents back and closed the folder. The strange sense of foreboding crept up on me again. On a plane heading south, we took off and the AC kicked in, blasting me with cold air. Antarctica, the last free place on Earth. No civilization, no nations, no governments. The only human activity allowed there was for science. In theory, at least. As long as the treaty held. From time to time, I could make out the lights of lonely ships in the vast ocean thousands of feet below. This time, I didn't dream. Everything just seemed to slip away. The only thing that was real was the journey ahead. I woke up.